Today I want to talk about Solipsist and how I beat insane roguelike difficulty with it. In the first part of the video, I'll go over all the Solipsist talents, and in the second one, I'll show you the character that I beat the game with and go more in depth talking about leveling, prodigies, gear, and so on. Solipsist is an unlockable class from the base game. It's very different from all the other classes, as the vast majority of its talent trees are entirely unique to Solipsist. It uses two resources, Psi and Feedback, both of these having double fatigue penalties. Psi is pretty basic at first glance. It has a nice deep blue color and goes down when you use your talents. Feedback then represents using pain as a means of psionic grounding, or in simpler terms, you gain feedback based on how much damage you take, and it then slowly decays over time. Let's get into the talents. You start the game with a single point in Solipsism, and you cannot unlearn it. It passively increases how much Psi you get, but also significantly reduces how much life you get on leveling up and from Constitution. Thankfully though, Psi is basically a second life bar, as up to 50% of all damage you take will be converted into Psi damage, which is then also reduced by almost half before it actually damages you, meaning before it simply lowers your Psi. To help with sustaining this, 50% of all healing and regeneration then applies to Psi instead of your life. So long story short, this makes you take a lot less damage, and it's a big part of why Solipsist is so powerful. The only downside is the Solipsism threshold, which reduces your global speed if you fall below a certain percentage of Psi. What this means is that Solipsist's biggest and pretty much only weakness is dealing with really critical, bad situations, as when your life gets low, so will your Psi, and then you not only have to deal with the danger of just dying, but you also act a lot slower, making stabilizing more difficult. Balance is a passive that lets you substitute up to 75% of your mental saves for physical and spell saves. So obviously this is completely useless, as saves are just a joke of a mechanic. Or are they? First, a quick reminder of how saves work. When you hit an enemy with, let's say, stunning blow, your physical power gets compared to the enemy's physical save. If they are equal, you have a 50% chance to stun them. If you are 18 points over, you reach the maximum chance possible of 95% to stun them. This means that unfortunately, saves cannot ever make you completely immune to debuffs, but it's still incredibly powerful if you can get them high enough. So here's my Solipsist in Daikara. Keep in mind I have only a single point in balance at this point, and zero focus on saves through my gear. This level 25 Wormmaker Rogue Fox has 48 physical power, while I currently only have 27 physical save. Not great. A bit later I ran into this Paradox Mage Doomed, which I almost died to. It had 41 spell power and 44 mind power, compared to my 35 spell save and 44 mind save. So even with my best save, I got to at the most a 50% chance to resist debuffs against powerful enemies. Let's jump a bit forward. Here I'm level 38 in Dreadfell. This nasty Rogue Annihilator boss has 60 fist power compared to my 59 physical save. And you'll notice all my saves are pretty similar to each other at this point, and that's because I started putting points into balance. Against most enemies, I had at least a 50% chance to resist any debuff, which is not bad, considering I didn't focus on it. Solipsist just gains a bunch of mind save through generally good talents. And then, by the end game, with a bit of focus through gear, I got to 90 plus on every save, making me almost immune to all debuffs by all enemies, like poor Grushnag here and his friends. Even the Stair Guardians in High Peak couldn't really touch me. I know this is a lot of information, but the takeaway is it's definitely possible to get your saves high enough for them to be impactful, even on Insane, although I wouldn't bother with them if your class or race doesn't support saves in some way. So balance is pretty good, as it lets you focus only on making your mind save really high. Clarity passively gives you up to 40% global speed, depending on how full your Psi is. Acting more is good. This will be close to the 40% pretty much always. You should max this. Dismissal lets you compare up to 68% of your mental save against any damage you take. If your mental save is higher, you reduce the damage by 50%, and if it crits, it gets further reduced by your crit multiplier. So if you put any points into this, it will only be in the late game, once you start building up your mind save, and even then, it usually only works on damage over time, as attacks or spells will be too big to get affected by this. My character got to around 100 mind save, so I'd reduce any damage 67 or lower to almost nothing. It's not bad. The way I built my character, I had a lot of extra points, so I ended up maxing it, but you could also just not put points here at all to not push your Solipsism threshold higher. Now let's go in order, starting with the two first trees, which focus on physical damage. Distortion Bolt is a range 10 3-turn cooldown bolt that ignores resistances, which is very good, but it pays for it with slightly lower base damage. Then all the Distortion talents decrease physical resistance depending on how much you invest into this tree. It should end up being around 15 to 20%, and they also distort the enemy, making the following Distortion talent have an additional effect. Distortion Bolt's effect is that it just does 50% extra damage. Distortion Wave is a massive AoE which deals some damage and knocks back. What really makes this talent though is that if the targets are already distorted, they'll be stunned for up to 4 turns, and it's only a 6-turn cooldown. Pretty good. As you'll see in a bit, it's a great follow-up to Maelstrom. Ravage is a long-lasting damage over time effect. If the target is distorted, it does 50% more damage, and you can strip physical sustains or beneficial effects. So, for this talent to be worth casting, you need targets that will survive for at least 5 to 6 turns, which won't be a lot of them. Investing into it should be a pretty low priority, but you still get 5 turns for a single point, so it can still fulfill its niche of stripping physical effects. Maelstrom is an excellent final talent, and it's basically Ravage, but in a medium-sized AoE that also keeps pulling enemies to its center. It is the perfect opener as it distorts everything, and it itself has no distortion bonus. The second physical tree is Dreamsmith. Dreamsmith's hammer hits an enemy and brings up to 2 random Dreamsmith talents of cooldown. Then you also get this whole text box, which a few other talents have, but you might not have seen it before. Basically, this talent creates its own weapon, which you can see the stats of it here, and it's a very good weapon since it scales off of 120% of your willpower, and this weapon is then used for all the talents in this tree. So when Hammer Toss says that it deals weapon damage, it means the damage of the Dream Hammer, not the weapon in your hands. And this is the highest damage talent in this tree, as it does up to 300% weapon damage really, since you will aim the talent right on the enemy you want to damage, so it instantly gets hit as it comes back. This has 11 range by the way. Dream Crusher is Stunning Blow fused with Weapon Mastery, so you'll want to max this eventually if you rely on this tree. Forge Echoes is a bit of extra AoE and also gives you a bit of on-hit damage for the Dream Hammer, but this talent is not very good. Hammer Toss or the Distortion talents will cover all of your AoE needs, and the on-hit isn't a lot of damage either. This is a 1-pointer at best. So both of these trees are powerful, and they're even pretty thematic. I like the way they're written. But it's physical damage, which you get access to all the time. But what if I told you the rest of this class is about sleep and dreams and nightmares and mind damage? That's right, mind damage. When's the last time you played a class with that? You know how enemies in the late game have like 70% resistance to your damage type and it's pretty annoying? Well, resistance to mind damage is very rare on mobs, which simply makes it the best damage type. But maybe the talents suck, right? Let's have a look at Psychic Assault. Mind Seer is a 7 range, 2-turn cooldown beam doing mind damage. You could probably put 5 points into this and nothing else and get to the first Prodigy. It does more damage than the average beam, has a shorter cooldown, and it just makes the early game feel a little too easy almost. Honestly, if there was a way to make it have a cooldown of 1, you would just cast it every single turn. Anyways, it doesn't end here. We also get Psychical Lobotomy, which cripples the target's higher mental functions, which is important, and does some damage, but mainly applies a decently strong confusion effect. Some enemies do not have higher mental functions, and they're completely immune to this ability. It won't even deal damage. An example would be a Bone Giant. There are not too many of these enemies, but just so you know why it sometimes just fizzles. Otherwise, it's a great talent, potentially making your enemies skip their turns. Synaptic Static is just a big AoE around your character. It's good, but not really needed, as Mindseer does more damage and it's a beam, so it can usually deal with many enemies just fine. Low priority to invest into. Sundermind does some damage and reduces the target's mental save. If the target is brain locked, which is a debuff applied when your mind power is a lot higher than the opponent's mental save, its effects are doubled. Still lower damage than Mindseer though, but it's good, since as you'll see shortly, reducing enemy mind save can be pretty important. Now we get to the sleep tree. Slumber puts the target to sleep for up to 5 turns, making it unable to act. Unfortunately, if you damage the target, the duration gets lowered, and eventually you will hit so hard that you just wake up enemies instantly. But that's okay, because you don't put enemies to sleep to immediately try to kill them. It's usually to have time to cast debuffs or kill the other enemies. You'll see why all the sleeps are good once we get to Inner Demons in the Nightmare tree. Also, each time a target wakes up from any sleep effect, they get Insomnia, which gives a bit of sleep immunity, which can stack, so you can't sleep something permanently. Restless Night makes the targets also take a bit of mind damage when they wake up. The damage is pretty low, so a very low priority to put more points here. Sandman increases the damage threshold before enemies wake up, not even close to enough though. It also makes Insomnia give lower sleep immunity, which is nice, but one-pointer kind of nice. Dreamscape is a cool talent. It lets you enter a sleeping target's dreams, literally. You'll get teleported to a new area, similar to Fearscape, where you will fight the target's mind projections, which, depending on how many you kill, will then damage the target when you come out. So, contrary to the idea behind this talent, I never use this on uniques or bosses, even though they would deal 50% less damage. It's still usually not the best idea to let enemies like that multiply. Instead, this talent works well as a sort of a reset tool when you need to heal or get an important cooldown back. You can target some sleeping trash mob and just run around for 8 turns. It works great that way, just for a single point. Continuing the trend of having the tree named the same as the first talent, we have Thought Forms, which summon a single guardian to assist you in combat. You can get a bowman, a warrior, or a defender. These, especially the bowman, are alright combatants in the very early game, but they quickly get outscaled. Transcendent Thought Forms lets them learn some of the Solipsist's general talents, and none of them really do all that much for the summons, so I won't waste your time showing them, we'll get to them eventually. This is a one-pointer to get to the other talents. Overmind lets you directly control your thought form, giving it a bunch of extra stats, but leaving your body, as it's aptly written, a defenseless shell. I don't know about you, but I personally really don't feel comfortable leaving my body as a defenseless shell. You never know whether some enemy you pulled 30 turns ago was just spazzing out in a tunnel somewhere, only to suddenly stab you in the back. Even if that wasn't a problem, the summoned just shouldn't ever be more powerful than you. If you invest into this, it copies some of your stats, but I didn't find putting any points here worth it, because all you need your Guardian for is Thought Form Unity. This gives you either Mind Speed, Mind Power, or a Resist All, while a specific Thought Form is active. All of these stats you want. I ended up using the Bowman the most, since he usually survives the longest and gives speed. Each of the Guardians have their own cooldown, so if one dies, you can always summon the other ones. I think this is worth maxing eventually. For the locked trees, we have Discharge first. Mindstorm is a sustain that makes you fire bolts of mind damage at targets in range 10, but only one per hostile target. Here's the problem though, you cannot move while this talent is active. You do get increased range for some of your talents, so the idea is you become like a turret, but having to stand still feels like too high of a price. So many things can happen, requiring you to reposition, and it has 8 turns of cooldown, so it's not like you can take a few steps and turn it on again. I just hate this. I'm not saying it's horrible necessarily. There are insane winners in the character vault that have 5 points in Mindstorm, so it can definitely work, but it's not for me. Each of the bolts also costs feedback, which would be difficult to manage if it wasn't for Feedback Loop, which inverts the usual feedback decay, meaning you regenerate it instead. You'll need some points in this if you want to use these talents. Backlash is a passive that makes you retaliate when you take damage for either the feedback gained from the attack or a really low number, whichever is lower. So not great, but wait, Focused Wrath kind of redeems it a little bit. It powers up all your Discharge talents, letting them target only a single enemy, so Mindstorm for example, if there are 5 targets, you will still fire 5 bolts, but all will go to the chosen target, and then you get a bunch of crit multi, and you get to ignore some mind resistance with talents in this tree. So, do you want to stand still for this? It's up to you. Me, personally, I'm more of a Nightmare guy. Nightmare is a radius 7 cone that puts things to sleep. It has a tiny damage threshold for waking up, but as I mentioned, that doesn't really matter. And it does a bit of darkness damage, which also doesn't matter. But a big AoE sleep is nice to have, and now we finally get to Inner Demons, one of my favorite talents in the whole game. It's a single target debuff that gives up to around a 30% chance each turn for the enemy to spawn a copy of themselves, which will be your ally. The copy's life scales with the enemy's rank, so the stronger the target, the tankier the inner demon. Have you ever wanted to see Urkis fight himself? Or maybe Celia, with all her annoying summons. How about giving her a taste of her own medicine? Or what about 5 Demon Elandars trying to murder their original? There is nothing else like Inner Demons in Tome. The complete and utter chaos this talent can create is beautiful to behold. But it's not just funny, it's very powerful. The copies can often kill enemies by themselves, or at the very least, tank for a really long time. There's just one little catch. If the enemy makes a successful mental saving throw, when the demon would spawn, it doesn't spawn, and Inner Demons is removed from the target. It's also a fear, and a lot of things in the late game have a 100% fear immunity. But this is where the sleeps come in, as sleeping targets have their mental save halved and their fear immunity is ignored. The other catch is that when Inner Demons successfully triggers, it removes all sleeps on the target, so you have to reapply it, but that can be done. This talent is Solipsist for me. Sure, you have the Mind Beams or the physical talents, those are both really powerful, and you could definitely beat the game without going Inner Demons, but why deprive yourself of this really fun, really powerful tool? Okay, and there's one final catch with this talent, it's a little buggy. Once the fight is over, and there are no more hostile targets, the Inner Demon will sometimes attack you. Just for a single turn, but if you are low, this could lead to a really painful death. So just remember that these demons are not to be trusted. Also, I need to mention, if an enemy Solipsist applies this debuff to you, you need to get it cleansed immediately. Your Inner Demons can kill you really quickly. This is not a gamble worth taking. Waking Nightmare is another single target debuff that does a bit of darkness damage, but has an up to 50% chance to cause either blindness, stun, or confusion. All of these are excellent debuffs to put on your enemies. It's again a fear, but again, when they're sleeping, that doesn't matter, and their chance to resist the debuff is halved, which I think is talking about mental saves again, but it could also mean that with a 50% chance, you'd get a 75% chance to apply the debuff when they're sleeping, but either way, this talent is really good. Night Terror, on the other hand, is not. It's Sustain that gives you increased damage and penetration against sleeping targets, and it also summons a guy when you kill a sleeping target. This goes against all the other talents in this tree. When you sleep a target, you want to cast Inner Demons and Waking Nightmare, and let them sleep until Inner Demons procs, then sleep them again, let Inner Demons proc. You get the idea. Why would you hit them for a bit more damage and instantly wake them up? It just doesn't make sense. I don't think this talent is worth a single point. For the general talents, we have the very common Survival. Trek is incredible, Device Mastery can be good, the other talents are whatever. Then there's Dreaming. Sleep puts enemies in a tiny radius to sleep. You never say no to more sleeps, but this can be kept as a one-pointer. Lucid Dreamer is a sustain that puts you into a lucid dream, making you asleep but still letting you act. It also increases all your saves and gives you increased damage against targets with insomnia, which will be everything. This sustain is excellent. It also makes you more vulnerable to things like inner demons, but you should always be ready to cleanse these anyways. Dreamwalk is a horrible teleport. It's 7 range, but if you don't target a sleeping creature, which you probably won't, it's a bit random. It's still a teleport, so it can help you get out of being surrounded, and it saved me a couple of times in my run, but I still hate it. It can even teleport you through walls, by the way. It's still good enough for a point. Ideally, you would put more in, but Solipsist is really starved for generic points. Dream Prison is a sustain that makes all sleeping targets in range 7 sleep for as long as the sustain is active. Basically, it makes their sleep duration stop ticking down, but you can still wake them through damage or inner demons triggering. The downside is, this effect constantly drains a percentage of your psi. This is not as big of a downside as it might seem, because you're likely to go Antimagic and Fungus and a Regen Infusion, but I just don't really like this talent even by itself. It's cool, but I don't see a good scenario for it. I don't think it's worth a single point. Mentalism. Psychometry passively gives you mind power for your psionic, nature and anti-magic items equal to the shown numbers or 200% of the object's material level, whichever is lower. What is an object's material level? It's the tier of the item, but don't worry about calculating anything. This talent shows you exactly how much mind power you're gaining, and it's great. You probably won't be maxing it, but some mind power is always good, and this can give a decent amount. Mental Shielding is here to save you from ever getting in a demon. It cleanses your current mental debuffs and blocks additional ones over 6 turns. For 2 points, you get 3 effects cleansed, which should be enough, and this talent is great. Every class would love this. Projection is really bizarre. It projects your mind out of your body, and this projection is invisible, doesn't have to breathe, and can move through walls. All damage you then take is shared with your physical body, and you can only deal damage to targets you mind link, which is the next talent in this tree. So I tried this talent a decent amount, and I don't like it. First, again, it makes you completely vulnerable while you are crawling through walls, and the payoff is that you can maybe sleep an enemy and inner demon them through a wall, only to teleport back to your body and let them fight it out. Or, if you use Mind Link, which lets you target an enemy and then deal more mind damage to them, you can fight, but then why are you doing it through projection? Just walk around the corner. I like Mind Link a little better than projection. It could be useful in a world where you have more generic points, but you don't, so I don't think either of these is worth it. Now a tree all about feedback. Biofeedback slows down your feedback decay and makes the decay heal you. The heal is negligible though. This is a one-pointer because you really want Resonance Field, which is an instant speed shield that lasts 10 turns, but only absorbs 50% of the damage you take, which doesn't matter. This is really nice, especially in the early game, since this will help you survive to the point you get Fungus and become nearly unkillable. Don't worry, we're getting to it very soon. Amplification increases your maximum feedback and makes you gain more of it. Only may be needed if you go Discharge and Mindstorm. Otherwise, this is not even worth a point. Conversion uses feedback to restore a bunch of resources, but not by big enough amounts to be worth investing into. Dreamforge is the only generic locked tree. Forge Shield is a sustain that gives you flat damage reduction, but only when an attack does more than 15% of your effective health. This is good. I love flat reduction, but this being conditional and not that high at the start, even though it gets progressively bigger the more damage types you block, makes it not crazy good, and again, you really need to spend your generics carefully. Forge Bellows does some damage, but mainly knocks back in a medium-sized cone and spawns walls everywhere to delay the enemies even further. It's okay, but I'd still always rather just use a movement infusion instead of relying on the random wall spawns. Forge Armor gives some armor and defense, and a bit of Psi when you get hit, or worth a point at best. And now, we saved the best for last. It's the Dream Forge. Each turn that you remain stationary, oh god, it's one of these ones again. Look, long story short, this talent is pretty bad, even if you could move while using it. Let's move on to the actual categories you'll be spending your generic points on: Antimagic, Fungus, and Mindstar Mastery. I consider these almost part of this class, as Solipsist gets so much benefit from Fungus especially, so I'll go over them briefly and talk more about it in the build guide section. You get the Antimagic talent tree by joining Zigger. Resolve gives you a lot of resist for any non-phase non-mind damage that hits you. 3 points is the sweet spot to get the bonus for up to 3 elements, it's very good. Anti-Magic Zone lets you silence enemies in an AoE, perfect for shutting down casters and doesn't really need more than 1 point. Anti-Magic Shield is nuts. It's a huge flat damage reduction for non-phase non-mind damage, but it steadily increases your equilibrium as it blocks damage. Since Solipsists can't really easily lower equilibrium, it's a matter of time until the shield fails, so there's not much point into investing into it heavily, you're just accelerating the inevitable. Still, this talent is super powerful. Mana Clash drains the target's resources, deals some damage and decreases your equilibrium, but most importantly, after you defeat Orcus, the Zigger leader will upgrade this talent for you and also make it remove 4 magical sustains, making it excellent. Once you defeat Orcus, you also get access to Fungus. This is where Solipsist stops being fair, as you eliminate your only weaknesses. Wild Growth gives you a bunch of max life and life regeneration. You're supposed to have low max life to balance the tankiness gained from Solipsism, but this fixes that for you. I like maxing this. Fungal Growth passively increases the duration of regenerations on you. What you can do with this is have a regeneration infusion reach a higher duration than its cooldown, so you can permanently have it on. The amount of points this requires will depend on the specific regen infusion and your mind power, but don't be afraid to put as many points into Fungal Growth as needed, as this lets you keep your life and more importantly your Psi almost always full. Ancestral Life lets you very slowly decrease your equilibrium and lets you act a bit more when you non-regeneration heal yourself. There are apparently some big-brained ways you can abuse this talent to be insanely strong, but I just put a single point here and I'm happy. Sudden Growth can heal you for a decent amount when your life regeneration is going. 1 point is again enough. Then you can also unlock the Mindstar Mastery tree at the gem store in Zigger. This gives you Psi Blades, which is a great talent if you want to melee things, which you probably don't. But then you get Thorn Grab, which is an instant speed melee slow. Great to use before movement infusioning away. Leaves Tide is a ridiculous talent. For 7 turns on max rank, it gives you a high percentage chance, I got to 51% on my character, to completely avoid any damaging attack. That's pretty good. And then Nature's Equilibrium is good, but again, more for characters focusing on weapon damage with Mindstars. So here's my guy. Straight from the final boss. As always, these are the add-ons that I use. None of them affect gameplay, but you can look through them. Let's start with the stats. First, you have to go willpower, and it's kind of a no-brainer, as it powers all of your talents, and it gives you Psi. You'll notice I only have 58 willpower. That's because I drank the Sandworm Guardian. When you come from the east, you can drink its fluids, and it raises or downgrades your stats, and it downgraded my willpower by 2, but at that point I was already max level, so I couldn't put the points back, so that's why I chose 58. Second, you go Cunning, just to pump up your damage, get your crit chance really high, and it also gives you a bit of mind power. And third, I just put it into Constitution. Even though it gives you a bit less life, it still gives you some life, and maybe more importantly, it gives you healing mod, so improves all your healing. And since I'm running a healing infusion always, I get a lot of value out of it. Then the rest you can split into dexterity or strength, whatever you need for your gear. For my race, I chose Kornak, and I chose it because I, for some reason, thought I need it. But you don't need it. You don't need it for the category point. The extra generic points are nice, but I don't think it's worth it. I put the last category point just into Solipsism. You can put it into a category to give it 0.2 extra mastery, which is really close to being useless. It adds like 10 damage or 20 damage to a damaging spell, or 1 or 2 percentages into Solipsism, which is what I did. But it's really not worth it. So the leveling template I'll be showing with a dwarf, because I think it's a pretty cool race that you don't get the chance to pick a lot, because on a lot of classes you don't care much about saves, but here it's really synergistic with dismissal and balance, and you can make do. Even with less talent points, I think you can be just fine playing dwarf. The leveling, like I mentioned, should really be easy. You put 5 points into Mindseer, and then you also max out Solipsism, just so you don't get randomly one-shot by some physical damage mob early on. Once you have those 10 points, and then you put it into Clarity, so you get a lot of global speed, and then you're pretty good to go. You just put a single point into all the other talents, so you get your Thought Form, which can tank a little or give you some extra stats. And then you slowly progress into Nightmare, and you get Inner Demons, so that you stop being a one-trick pony, just casting Mindseer. You get more options to deal with unfair situations, which are bound to happen eventually on Insane. So the class points I think are pretty close to the best you can do, but the generic tree, I made a decent amount of mistakes, because I wasn't really familiar with Antimagic. I don't play it often, and I've never won on an Antimagic character yet, so I did a lot of the basic mistakes, like maxing Antimagic shield, which is just not necessary because you don't have the equilibrium regeneration for it. The rest I think should make sense from the talent overview. I maxed out Leaves Tight because it's just really powerful, although I now see that it has 51% chance on 4 and 5 points. I only put 2 points into Psyblades. Like, I've seen some people on the forums swear that you should always max this, that it's really good. But if you don't melee, it's really not good. All it gives you is the mind power, willpower and cunning multiplication, but that's not a lot. Even though I have a decent amount of it on my mind stars, I got more mind power out of just putting points into Psychometry. So you should split points between Psyblades and Psychometry, depending on which one gives you the most value. You shouldn't put them all in just a single one of them. The one big thing that I didn't mention is the Prodigies, which are pretty game-changing actually. The first one I took is Windtouched Speed. This requires 50 dexterity, so you need to have some dexterity gear, but that should be easy to find. The bigger problem is having 10 talents that use Equilibrium, which will be the Antimagic talents or Mindstar Mastery. These all use Equilibrium, but by level 25 you might not have enough points to put into all of these, since you'll want to make sure you have like Mental Shielding and Lucid Dreamer and Resonance Field. But don't forget that you can always just put 3 points into one of these talents, get the Prodigy, and then take them out. So it shouldn't be too big of a problem. And what this actually does is gives you 20 permanent global speed, which is okay, 10% cooldown reduction, which is only okay, right? So 10% is not that much, but this 10% rounds down. So your Mindseer, that usually has 2 cooldown, suddenly only has a cooldown of 1. So yes, you do get to fulfill the fantasy of casting this every single turn. And you should basically cast it every single turn, but as you'll notice, you will still have it on cooldown, because you obviously will end up with higher global speed, so you'll be acting more than once per turn, so you still have time to use your other talents. Then for the second Prodigy, I went with Spine of the World, just because I felt that the only way I can die is to just get debuffed to Oblivion. And you could say it's overkill, since I already have really high saves, and it's definitely preference, this second Prodigy. You could go Adept, some people like going Adept, I don't like it too much personally. You could try something like Fungal Blood, you could go Draconic Veil, which is similar and it works on all detrimental effects. You could go Master of Disasters, just to push your mind power really high. You could just go Mental Tyranny to get extra mind damage penetration. There's Eye of the Tiger, which reduces all your psionic talents when you mind crit, which should be really often. I managed to get to a 100% crit chance, so you could make a great argument for Eye of the Tiger. But I'm satisfied with Spine of the World. It feels good to have. And when you go overkill on cleansing debuffs, what this lets you do is just use the wild infusions as just reduce all damage taken, right? You can pop this at the start of a fight and you have 41% damage reduction for 5 turns. So having too many ways of cleansing effects is not actually a downside. Now if you're watching this and the new DLC is out, which should be out soon, but in Tales of Maj'Eyal, soon works a little differently than you're probably used to, but I assume eventually it will come out. And in that case, there will be an extra evolution here. And this one is the Recture Scanning, which is just not very good and you shouldn't really ever take it. But then there are class evolutions, which drastically change the way a class is played. And there's not a lot of them. I think there's like 5 or 6. And there's 2 on Sun Paladin. There's 1 or 2 for Archmage. And they're really cool. They usually either give you a new talent tree or sometimes even change all your already existing talents. So they're really exciting ways of playing that class. They're almost like a whole new class, really. And in the new DLC, there should be a Solipsist evolution called Psy Ghost. So if you see it here, I doubt you can just pick it and make it work with a build like this. If you like the look of it, you might have to edit the talent tree a little bit. I also want to show you the Fungal Grow, how it works with the Regen Infusion. So you'll see it has a 12 turn cooldown, but when I click on it, it lasts for 13 turns. And it's actually even better than that, because I have Infusion Saturation, so let me get rid of that. Now it's only a 10 turn cooldown, and it lasts for 13 turns, so I have 3 turns of just being able to do whatever I want before having to click on it again. It's a bit annoying, because this will change throughout the game as you gain more mind power and change your Regen Infusion. But it's not like if you put too many points into this, it's bad, right? If it lasts longer, okay, you don't have to worry about it for some extra turns. So I think that's it about the talents. It's really quite simple, and I've said most of it in the talent overview. So always max health thick skin, 1 in heavy armor training for gauntlets, helms, boots, 1 in light armor for some reduced fatigue. Which, speaking of armor, I don't actually have any form of defense against physical damage. Usually you get either defense or you go armor, but I don't have either, right? 12 armor, 36% armor hardiness, that doesn't help much, and 60 defense is also not really enough for the late game, but you just don't need it. I have only 37 physical resistance, so this could be higher, and the closest I've come to dying in the late game was a rogue. I think it just might have been a rare even, not even a boss. And it dropped me to like 75% HP. That's the most damage I've ever taken. So ideally you would have a bit higher physical resist. About going anti-magic and when you should do it, I did the test at level 15. Once I had Mind Seer, I had Solipsism maxed out, and I had Psychic Lobotomy and a couple of Fears and the Feedback Shield. The majority of the test is really easy, as you will just deal with the enemies, no problem. But the last one is an Orc Corruptor, which will be much higher level than you, and he seriously hurts and puts a bunch of debuffs on you. So he can be pretty tough. You should utilize the stones in the arena to break vision, so you can get your cooldowns back. If you just stand still and just try to burst him, he might just kill you. And there's no real need to rush this. You can wait until level 20 or level 25. But by level 25, you ideally will have the Antimagic talents so that you can get Windtouched speed. And then for Fungus and killing Orcus, You don't have to rush anything, I just did the same order of dungeons that I always do. If you do it earlier, you might not have the generic points for the Fungus talents anyways. So the Inscriptions are not too different from what I usually run. I still went for a healing infusion, just so when I do get bursted, this can help me get a burst of healing, so the regeneration has time, a few turns to kick in and do its work. Then a movement infusion, as always, and then I ran a wild for physical and a wild for magical and mental effects, and the physical, if you do go Spine of the World, just aim for the highest damage reduction percentage for 4 turns, and really just don't be afraid to use it at the beginning of fights. I'll talk about items. I had the privilege of just purely focusing on damage and crit, since I didn't really need any immunities. I still have a 100% stun immunity, but Confusion you don't really need, since you have mental shielding, which should take care of any mental affecting enemy. Before I show you the items, I'm using a mod that changes the item descriptions a little bit. It should be mostly self-explanatory, just note that this minus means an immunity, so stun minus would mean stun immunity, for example. So on my head, I had an Omniscience, or Omniscience, that sounds better. I mostly had it on because it's a unique, and I like wearing uniques, since they usually look different, and you don't get to use them a lot, right? They're usually quite specific. But this one basically has all the stats you want, just not too many of them, and something like the rest cap for mind resistance, you don't really care about it getting higher, and the confusion resistance, it gives plus 40. So why do I have it at 0? Well, that's because of the Shard of Insanity, which gives me a minus 100% confusion immunity. But in exchange for that, I get some damage mod, some resistance penetration, a bunch of mind save, and on mind hit, it's under mind, so I like this one. One of the better stats is the 5% confusion on melee, or melee retaliation, which basically doesn't exist for me because I don't usually get hit in melee. I just run away and create more distance, and I don't attack in melee, so if you don't find it, any decent unique amulet will do. And now the rest of my gear is just a lot of crit. You will need a lot of crit on your gear to get to that 100%. Spellhunter Remnants, these are a classic on any anti-magic character, since they are basically the rune of dissipation, but on your gloves, so it doesn't even take an inscription slot, and the stats themselves are alright. Sure, the nature damage I don't do, but the rest of it is pretty good. 15% mind crit is not bad, and 10 cunning, 10 willpower. They're just very powerful gauntlets. You should find these on basically every run. Just don't forget that you need to upgrade them, you need to devour arcane unique items, and each one will increase the tier of the Spellhunter Remnants until eventually they reach tier 5 and unlock the Destroy all magic effects and sustains ability. My belt is just some life and some crit multi, very basic. My boots, again, just give me mostly crit multi, some cunning. You will notice a trend here. My psionic shield has again crit multi, some mind power, 14 willpower. Guess what I have on my lantern? That's right, it's more crit multi. On my rings you'll notice some saves. It's really not a lot, but even a little bit can help. The other ring is back to the usual for some more crit multi and mind power. My robe is the best in slot you can get. These are actually all the mods on it are the best, the ones that I wanted the most. And then both of my mind stars are also pretty ridiculous, with just all the tasty damage stats that you would ever want. If you're wondering about DMG.resonant, I think that's damage resonance, which is supposed to be damage going through shields. Psi ret is how much psi you get when you get a hit, and psi m.crit is how much psi you get on crit. But these don't really matter, you could just delete these and this item would still be ridiculous. Just so you can bask in the glory of my items, I have a 266% crit multi, 218% damage modifier, 70% damage penetration, so that's the maximum, 100% crit chance, 111 mind power, 128 mind speed. Yeah, it's pretty good. So these are the stats that you should be focusing on. At least once you get through the very early game, but again, max life will definitely be helpful just so you don't get randomly one-shot. For the Escorts, you want willpower, followed by cunning. With some of these Escorts, since you'll be betraying them to Zigger, you might get the option of getting a generic point basically, so like with this Alchemist I got a point in Psi Blades, so this is very valuable. For the Elixirs, I would 100% prioritize generic points over class points. This is a rare occasion, but you definitely want the generic points more. Then you still just take the class points, then willpower, then cunning. In conclusion, Solipsist is one of, if not the most powerful class in the game. It has very impressive damage, ridiculous tankiness, and is very strong right from level 1. This, coupled with the fact that almost all of its talent trees are unique, and having inner demons, also makes it a lot of fun to play. Next time, I'll probably be talking about Necromancer, I think. I also want to make a follow-up to the survival guide, but I might wait after the DLC comes out, which should be soon. Thank you for watching.